Thanks so much, Mark. And thanks, Katie and Bethany from the Internet Society for making this happen. This is kind of like a perfect event for Pew Research findings. We share data. You will be overstuffed with data by the end of my presentation. And then there are smart people who can tell you maybe what the data means. And I love it when we do the sort of two-step in that direction. I just need to start by thanking the many Pew colleagues who worked on this and really whose collective intelligence, collective analytical skills, and just goodwill and good work are part of this. So Laura Silver, Aaron Jones, Courtney Johnson, Jingjing Jiang, Kyle Taylor, Monica Anderson have all been instrumental contributors to this work, and I've loved working with them and thank them very much. So Pew is sort of a fun place to be. It's a legal subsidiary of the Pew Charitable Trusts. That's our main funder. We get funding from other foundations, but a large share of our funding comes from the trusts. We're nonprofit. We're nonpartisan, and we don't make recommendations. That is sort of the secret sauce of Pew. It would be a firing offense if I told you what I thought personally about these data, and if I gave you my own personal interpretation of what was going on. That's why we call ourselves actually a fact tank instead of a think tank, because we're in a different line of work from the people who work at think tanks and try to promote ideas and aggressively solve problems. That's not the business we're in. Pew Research Center, since the year 2001, has been doing global surveys, a lot focused on geopolitics, the reputation of the United States, the reputation of other major powers in the world, how people are thinking about the global economy and things like that. And since 2011, has been also doing some big, broad work on benchmarking technology adoption. But since 2001, when this work began, we've done interviews in 108 different countries. I'm going to be talking about 11 of those countries that we work in. But we, every year, have major surveys that also deal with other kinds of issues, and I would commend them to you if you're interested in those kinds of issues. So what I'm talking about today is work that we did in 11 emerging economies. We did it last fall into December. We interviewed overall 28,122 folks, so that's about 2,500 people, plus or minus, in these countries. They're face-to-face interviews, unlike a lot of the work that we have done in the United States, looking at how the internet has had social and political and economic impacts here, which was done with phone surveys. These were face-to-face surveys, which are fun to do, and they're challenging, and they present all sorts of complexity in the interviewing process. So having particularly our global colleagues along to school us on how to do this work and to help us figure out what it meant was a really important part of this work. In sampling that you do with 2,500 people, you get a margin of error in some of these findings. And a lot of the data I'm going to be talking about is median data. So we've taken together these 11 countries and picked out the median point of where they stand on various issues, as well as we're listing what's going on in individual countries. But I want to make sure you understand that we're not talking about an average of everybody we interviewed. It's based at the country level for medians. We also did and really learned a tremendous amount of surveys in 4 countries: Kenya, Mexico, the Philippines, and Tunisia. And we did this before we did the actual surveys and got exactly what researchers want out of that process. We got insights into vocabulary, literally how people talk about this stuff, which made us adjust our question language at times. We got an earful about some of the real stressors that are current in people's lives, related especially to politics and information policy and stuff. So we actually changed a basket of questions in the questionnaire to adjust to those really top-of-mind, urgent-seeming questions that were when we were exploring people's civic lives with these technologies. And we just released a report about an hour ago, and that's the website for it. And if you want to read along, you can use your phones, and I won't take offense if you're looking down instead of looking at me or looking at these screens. One of the most interesting part of the process was literally to pick which countries we were going to do. It was always my dream that the work that we would do launching this expansion of our work in the global community would focus on emerging economies. Because my hypothesis was that when you hand someone a device that connects them to other people in other parts of the world and not go through maybe the process of getting a wired computer and things like that, a certain kind of extra magic occurs in that moment where you haven't necessarily had a gradual introduction to connectivity. You've had an abrupt one, and it might sort of change the way people think about their social relations. It might change the way they think about their neighbors. It might change the way they think about their families and opportunities on the economic front. So that's why we picked 11 emerging economies to do this work. As you can see, we did it in Colombia, Mexico, Venezuela, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia, Kenya, and South Africa. So they're all middle-income countries under the definitions used by the World Bank. One of the things that we tried to explore with people was their migration status, both whether they'd come into the country from somewhere else or had family members go somewhere else, but also internal migration. Had they moved from the countryside to the city or moved away from their home village? We're going to put out other reports related to that, but it turns out that one of our hypotheses is really interestingly confirmed. When you have one of these devices, it changes the relationship you have with your old village. So when you've gone somewhere else, you can still stay in touch with your home village in interesting ways, but it also helps you navigate your new community, and we'll have a lot more to say about that later in the year. We also wanted to, one of the things we have learned in the process of doing all of that global work was that your phone, the device itself sometimes matters, and there's great diversity in how these devices are used in these different countries. So literally having a nice mixture in each of these countries of who has a smartphone, who has a feature phone, which maybe can connect to an app or have apps that connect to the internet, and maybe has a basic phone which doesn't have any real internet capacity. Figuring out the differences among people who have different devices turned out to be an interesting thing. We also wanted just diversity in the countries. So you can see from that list, we've got 4 regions of the world covered, different population structures, different economic structures, different political circumstances, and in some ways those are reflected in the data. We also wanted countries that had a variety of connectivity conditions, both their competitiveness and just generally what's available in those countries felt like an important variable to us, and we're going to be exploring that again in the subsequent reports that take a particularly hard look and a deep dive into digital divide issues. So here's what we learned in these 11 countries, just from an adoption standpoint of the main technologies we were looking at. You know, amazingly, 96% have some kind of access on average. Again, a median of 96% have some access to either owning or sharing a phone. And one of the reasons we sort of parsed their relationship to whether they owned it or borrowed it, there's a tremendously interesting academic literature on phone borrowers and phone entrepreneurs, people who would buy a phone and then lend it to other people as sort of a first stage process of entrepreneurship. And it turns out that it's not that big of a group. A median of 7% people said that they shared phones. But in a couple of cultures, for instance, Venezuela and India, you know, it's a consequential share of the population, and it was one of the interesting variables we looked at. We also captured in this data something that we've seen in other data that have been captured by our partners in the global survey work that's done around the world. Smartphones are advancing quite rapidly in the broad population of emerging economies, but also in these economies too. And this is like the perfect slide that validated our notion that getting diversity in device connections and device usage. Obviously, there are a couple of cultures where smartphones dominate, but there are a lot of cultures where basic phones are still a major part of the story. And we wanted to capture that too, because there are all sorts of ways that social connectivity and even political and economic connectivity matter, but they matter differently for people who have different kinds of devices. So that's the mobile phone story that we were particularly interested in capturing. We also, early on, knew that we were going to try to capture social media usage. And unlike asking a specific question, do you use social media, which is a confusing question to some people because they don't know sometimes which sites that would count as social media sites and which services. So we asked about 7 different specific kinds of social media sites and messaging app sites. And if you said yes to any one of these 7 devices, and in some cases, the next slide will show you people had multiple accounts in them, but if you said yes, you were counted as a social media user. And it's an amazingly powerful story, too, where a median of 64% of the people in these countries are some kind of social media or mobile app user. There's great variance, stretching from Lebanon at the top to India at the bottom. But the rise of social media in these cultures is as dramatic, in some respects, as the rise of phones. And here's a story that was so interesting to see because the American story is a little bit different as we've measured it. As we've watched social media grow in this country, we've watched people expand the number of accounts that they have. So they do Facebook for certain things and Twitter for certain things and Instagram for other things and stuff like that. In these cultures, that level of complexity shows up in some countries. The people who have 3 or more devices have a decent share of the population in a bunch of places. But it's much more common to just use 1 or 2. And in some cases not use any of the social media accounts at all. And if you look at that column, the 3rd column from the left, the one where people say that they only use 1 social account, we asked a follow-up question, which is, which one is it? And in those places where people are only using a single account, it's sort of divided between Facebook and WhatsApp about which that single account is. The other thing that's sort of clear in our data, and it's a very consistent story with the developed world story, is that social connectivity, the rise of smartphones and the rise of social media almost go hand in hand. 91% of smartphone owners are social media users, 81% of social media users are smartphone users. And you'll see in the data there are interesting ways in which people almost have an undifferentiated view about the role of these devices combined with the role of these services in their life. Although they do, when you press them on it, they will say different things in some cases about the impact and meaning of social media to them than they will say more generally about their phone use overall. The final part of the adoption story, so I've gone through the mobile phone story, the social media story, and now it's the internet story, because we're at the Internet Society. Again, from these global data that our colleagues at the Global Attitudes Division of Pew have looked at, there's been a flattening of internet use in developed countries that is consistent with American findings. You see this in Europe, you see this in advanced Asian economies, and the rise of internet connectivity in emerging economies is actually narrowing the gap between emerging economies and advanced economies. There are now, our latest data show that a median of 60% of folks use the internet across these cultures. And mobile connectivity is a big part of that story. Here are the nation-level data that reflect that. You'll see, India and Kenya and the Philippines and Tunisia have a somewhat different story from Jordan, Lebanon, Mexico, and places like that. And the rise of smartphones has been a big part of that increasing slope of the curve in the 11 countries that we were looking at. So a lot of folks in these cultures don't have other kinds of connected devices. They don't have a laptop or a desktop or a tablet at home. And again, this is sort of a wonderful, this was like, I wept for joy when I saw these data because it shows how different people connect to the internet, and there were ways that we could do analysis showing that their connectivity profile had some impact, at least in some cases, about the way they were thinking about it, the way they were using their devices. So a whole bunch of people connect to the internet sometimes with a connected device at home, but a lot of people rely exclusively on their phone for that connectivity. And our American data, one of the things that we would love to do in the next survey, if we ever do this, is to get more deeply into that story. In America or in other developed countries, there are some ways that people who have a smartphone-only relationship to the internet feel at deficit. They don't necessarily think that they can do all the things that the internet enables them to do relatively quickly, relatively efficiently, relatively easily when they're doing it on a small screen, maybe sometimes with a slower connection and things like that. We don't know that story here, but it would be a really interesting thing to explore because it seems intuitively like that might be the case. So that's the adoption story on the three main dimensions of technology. And we're highlighting a number of things in the report. Here are sort of 8 of the main things that we're saying. So the first point is that when we ask people about the broad impact of phones and social media on them personally and on their cultures generally, as a rule, just as they do in our surveys in America, people say the benefits to me are greater. More people say that they have benefits deriving from these things than say they have benefits deriving from social media. So at the personal level, this stuff really works. People really like it. They see, as you'll see in later slides, they get a lot of advantages out of it. But social media is still, a high number, more than more than 50% say that it brings benefit to their societies, but that number is smaller than the number of people who say that on the median in these countries, that they get a personal benefit out of it. And here's sort of the gap and country by country in each of these things. It's particularly pronounced in Jordan and Colombia, less so, but still importantly in Tunisia, Mexico, and the Philippines, and less so in these other cultures. I just have pointed out Venezuela. First of all, it was amazing to me that we could actually do a great survey in Venezuela. We had a brave vendor there, and we had just a wonderful experience capturing a society that's in great turmoil at the moment. And one of the signposts of that turmoil is that Venezuelans, more than anyone else in this survey, don't really see, not nearly as many of them see that they derive any kind of benefit, personal benefit, or that there are benefits in the culture, and that's represented by that sort of bottom line there. Now, when we get to this sort of, the internet's good for me, not maybe as good for society, there was one of the focus group folks who used Facebook as the window into that insight, saying it has brought a lot of advantages for our society. However, it has also affected society in a negative way. Just like anything which can be used for good and bad, social media have brought negatives and positives for people. That recurring thought that all of these technologies sort of have the same profile is illustrated in that quote. The other powerful takeaway from these findings is that as good as people feel about the role of the internet in their lives and the role in their culture, they're really worried about their kids. And there are a number of ways that we captured this in the survey. 79% are very concerned, 14% are somewhat concerned when we ask about should people be worried about children being exposed to harmful or immoral content when they use their mobile phones. 63% said, just as a straight verdict, mobile phones have had a bad influence on children in their country, and 54% said the internet has had a bad influence on the children of their country. Here's how consistent these data are. When the question was, how worried should people be about exposure to immoral or harmful content for their children, it was just a resounding vote of concern that folks have. And there was an interesting exchange in the Philippines focus group that sort of illustrated how this is sort of a multi-pronged concern in people's lives. So one of the participants said, children usually play with gadgets the most and are exposed to radiation and experiencing seizures. That's what I heard. So there's a lot of concern about the sort of physical impact of this stuff, which I don't necessarily know is an entirely settled issue. But immediately in response to that, a woman said, also, instead of playing outside, they're busy with their gadgets. They're no longer able to socialize with their kids. So they're worried about the content that kids are exposed to. They're worried about maybe physical impacts, and they're worried about social fallout from kids being more focused on their screens or on the devices rather than the world around them. So what do parents do about this, and what do people do about this? They are fairly vigilant about watching what's going on. So 52% of parents who have children, so it's just a subsample of our population, said they try to limit the time their child spends on the phone, and 50% said they monitor what their child is looking at or doing on the phone. There are places in particular where the emphasis on monitoring children is far more pronounced than it is on monitoring themselves. So a lot of people said that they are actually trying to limit their own time on the phone, but they were much more concerned, particularly in Lebanon and Jordan, about how much time their kids were spending on the phone and trying to enforce rules related to that. We also, on the monitoring question, they also were more likely to monitor their kids' behavior than they were their spouse's behavior. But there's sort of a story about new kinds of social surveillance that are in these data. You know, just watching what your kid is doing on the phone and checking up on what your spouse or partner is doing on the phone is now sort of a new dimension of some families' lives as they are bringing these gadgets into their lives. We asked a battery of questions about negative impacts of the internet. You'll see that we also asked about positive effects of the internet. And again, sort of in that leftmost column, you can see children being exposed to immoral or harmful content. That people were convinced that their societies ought to be worried about that. A median of 79% said that, as you saw on the other slide. But then they're worried about a range of other things. They're worried about identity theft and exposure to false and incorrect information. That number becomes particularly interesting when I will report a little bit later on that even as people are worried about exposure to incorrect information, they also say at the personal level, these devices have allowed them to get information and news more readily, more efficiently, more completely than they had in life before they had their phones. They worry about mobile phone addiction. Even as you'll see in a later slide, they also talk about the many and positive ways that they think about their phones. They worry about harassment and bullying. And they, fewer than half, or just around half, 48% of median, say losing the ability to communicate face-to-face. That's sort of juxtaposed with other findings that people sort of say, these new devices in my life, 93% say they help me communicate with people afar. So there's this kind of tension in people's relationship to these devices where sometimes they can very well articulate what some of the benefits are, and they can equally well articulate what some of their concerns are, and it's cross-pressured. There isn't necessarily a consistent linear story in all of these data. My favorite question battery in this survey was he asked people to give their, well, I call it their emotional inventory about their phones. And we asked them whether it ties them down or frees them, makes them waste time or helps them save time, whether they don't always need it or couldn't live without it. And you'll see that, you know, more people than not say it frees them rather than ties them down and helps them save time. But then when it comes to, is it essential? Do you feel like you can't leave home without it? Or they're more likely to say, I don't always need it. I can live without it in certain ways, and 33%, a median, said that they couldn't live without it. These are the country level data on this, and what's so beautiful about this slide is it plays out differently in so many ways in different cultures. The one consistent pattern was, and they don't always need or couldn't live without, is that there are, 5 of the 11 countries in this said one thing, they couldn't live without it, and 6 of the 11 countries said they don't always need it more often than not. And you'll see that in Lebanon, Tunisia, and Jordan in particular, which also sort of had high-level worry about phone addiction, that maybe that's an artifact that shows up here that they said they can't live without it, and maybe it's a relationship that they will acknowledge, but they're not entirely thrilled about it. There was this woman who wonderfully captured a bunch of this. Sometimes I try to use my phone less, so she's self-monitoring, but it only lasts for 2 or 3 days, and then I come back to the daily rhythm. So in a way, that just speaks to how these devices have insinuated themselves into the rhythms of people's daily lives. We asked about, this is the sort of positive battery of questions about attributes of the phone, and you can see that a median of 93% said that their phones help them stay in touch with those who live far away. 79% said they get information and news about important issues even as they worry about fake news and false information and that kind of stuff. 63% said it helps them make a living. 62% said it helps them concentrate and get things done, which also is cross-pressured with an addiction issue and other sort of dimensions that they worry about. And 58% said it helps them communicate face-to-face. Now, there are also some data later on in here that a share of people, not necessarily a high majority, but a share of people are kind of worried about what these devices do to family cohesion, but yet they will, in the sort of grand question about does it help your communication with others or not, they say yes, including off the phone and off the device. This is how this plays out in different countries. What is so striking is that, all the readings are very consistent, except maybe for the concentrate to get things done and communicate face-to-face. There are just sort of interesting patterns to this. Again, in separate focus groups, people talked about this. In general terms, communication is much more efficient. You are more interconnected, whether with your relatives or with world affairs, said one of the men in our focus group in Mexico. People meet less because of their phones. People use telephones to express themselves to avoid face-to-face discussions. So there's a sense that it's enabling in one set of circumstances and maybe socially harmful in other kinds of circumstances. Then we asked a series of questions about a variety of sort of big dimensions of society, the impact that increasing use of mobile phones, that was our question language, increasing use of mobile phones, how much has it affected these dimensions of life? And even as they worry about children, and even as they've got a lot to say about the things that are on their minds about the impact on children, education is the topmost thing that they say is the beneficiary of increasing use of mobile phones. Similarly, in the economy, local culture, and family cohesion, there's a little less support for the idea that increasing use has helped civility and politics. And then the concern about children, as well as physical health and morality, show up as things that people are fairly concerned about. I'm going to show you two slides here. I'm going to show you actually back-to-back two slides here because it's in a picture. The data are impossible to read. We're not expecting you to read them, but it's a beautiful mosaic that shows you the story about how people think about their phones. They don't just immediately think all good or all bad. They've got a variety of ways that they think about it, and it discriminates by the topic that they're asked about, the dimension of national life or community life that they're asked about. And this is, we asked about the impact of mobile phones, and we asked the same question about internet use. And if you compare those two slides, they're very consistent, that what people's answers, at least at the median level, are very much aligned, no matter whether you're asking them about mobile phones or the internet. And you just see this affirmation for what's going on in education, sort of lots of good feeling about the economy, and then lots of concern about children, physical health, and morality. Then every once in a while, in some of the previous work that we've done in global surveys, we've asked similar questions. So in some instances, we were able to compare 2014 answers in societies to these questions and then 2018 answers to these questions. And interestingly enough, as the internet has sort of spread and mobile phones, well, the internet in this case has spread, more people now than 4 years ago we're saying that the internet, that increasing use of the internet is a good influence on the economy and a good influence on education. And there's sort of interesting variance in the answers there. Some cultures say one and not the other. But it's an interesting pattern in the data. And it's a lot more mixed when the question becomes other dimensions of society like morality and politics. In some cultures, it seems to be working for the better, at least in the public estimation. And in other cultures, especially like Jordan, and to some degree Lebanon, which is pretty low down on all of these things, they're not so interested. So I'm going to be really interested in how our panelists interpret these findings from a cultural context, because there's the mosaic is in full evidence here, and different things seem to be going on in different cultures. And finally, there's a demographic story in these data that is a familiar one to you, but it's important just to highlight here. Sorry, again, it's a really dense slide, but the point here is that age matters a lot the younger people are, the more likely they, in this case, it's smartphone technology, but we essentially replicated this work with all the other technologies that we studied. Age is a huge determinant of whether people use or don't use this stuff. Class, which we use, educational attainment is a really good proxy for social class. That's a really big determinant. The higher level educational attainment someone has in the culture, the more likely they are to use this. And there's a really interesting, quite mixed story on gender. In some cultures, it matters a lot, and not only in the context of smartphones, but other things. And in some cultures, it doesn't matter hardly at all. So I have two takeaways from these data. One is that we're living in a McLuhan future. With this man in Kenya, 24-year-old man in Kenya in a focus group said, I think mobile phones have made the world a global village. Marshall McLuhan sort of coined that term, wrote 2 books with that title in the 1960s. He actually ripped it off from James Joyce, who made references to sort of global village-y kinds of things without using that exact phrase in Finnegan's Wake in 1939. But here now is a man who's using that phrase that one of the great futurists of all time used long ago. Now it's common parlance in Kenya and in some of the other places. And one of the other wonderful insights that McLuhan had was that once common people pick up a phrase, it means that the impact of that media has already taken hold in the culture, and another new paradigm, another new set of circumstances has taken hold. And I think we might be onto something, at least in some of the insights we got in the focus groups. There's this, when you combine social and mobile in particular, and when you think about these devices as an adjunct to your body, maybe another body part, as an auxiliary amplifier of who and what you are and the things you want. This woman in the Philippines had this beautiful line, it's like mobile phones become your partner. So that's the cyborg kind of way that I'm thinking about this. And I'm really interested to take your questions and then hear how the panelists are thinking about these data. Thanks. So are there any about these data? And I apologize, as I should have at the beginning, I'm the product of the worst speaking culture in America, New York. And I talk way too fast, so I apologize, especially to people listening to this. But I'm excited about our data, and I just couldn't not, speak at the speed I did. Mike.
Lee, you weren't kidding about how rich the data set is. This is really exciting. I noticed in several of the data sets that Kenya and Venezuela really stood out as having more people, more positive about more things. Is it possible that's due to particular applications that are available there and not in other places? Certain use cases, like in Kenya, they've got mobile money everywhere, and so you don't necessarily have to use the internet for PayPal or Venmo. They
asked
have
Alice,
it built in.
who's from Kenya. She's on the panel after this.
And then the other thing in Venezuela is, the mobile phone is almost a lifesaver if it's telling you where to get food or where the stores aren't empty. There are lots of unique use cases in Venezuela. So I'm speculating here.
And we don't speculate. That's a dirty word at Pew. It's again one of those firing offense words. But it's clearly in Kenya the story, as Alice will describe in much more detail. There's just an energy and a sort of culture of innovation that have, almost very quickly sort of changed people's nature to the state, changed people's nature to each other in Kenya. That's probably an interesting thing to explore there. In Venezuela, what was so interesting about our consideration of Venezuela in this data set was we designed the questions when economic stresses were foremost in people's minds. So in September to December when we were filling the survey, and the political crisis has sort of emerged from that later than our data can capture. And there was some, as we've shared these data and talked about them internally, there's some sense that any culture that's under those kinds of stressors, maybe the lifeline sensibility is part of it. And there's, you hear the news accounts out of Venezuela about sort of ad hoc, self-forming communities of people sort of finding relief or making each other's lives somewhat easier. So we don't know whether that's the story there. A bunch of other data in Venezuela are much more sort of downbeat. People are less enthusiastic and less happy with the state of things. So it's a more of a mixed bag in Venezuela. Yeah, George.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, this is a fairly rich data set. There's one variable that I would have liked to have seen in here, and I'm sure there are many more you'd like to see in there, but the impact of price, the cost of the mobile phone system, the cost of internet connectivity on smartphones. Did you look into that at all? Did you attempt any normalization?
Yes, we didn't ask about price particularly. We formed our questions. We're going to issue a whole report on digital divide stuff, in which that is going to be a centerpiece. And we went to school on a lot of really interesting scholarship around what's called the metered mentality. Do people, how affordable are data plans? Do they ever struggle to get electricity? Do they have to shut off their phones every once in a while, or go, on foraging for Wi-Fi kind of things? And we know that there's a really interesting story in there. The other challenge that we had in these data that our smart methodologists figured out, asking income questions in Venezuela was a mopes game, and so we asked about deprivation, measures of deprivation. You struggle to pay for healthcare, food, clothing, shelter, and things like that. And we've got some really rich findings related to that we're going to put out a little bit later on. Mm-hmm. The other good source of information on that, I think, is data sets issued by GSMA that have pricing data built into it, although I'm not sure it's normalized so that you can figure out whether it's costly or not. Other thoughts, or should we let the panel have at it?
Well, this might be cheating because I have the mic, but I have a question for you.
Go for it.
So you mentioned at the beginning that it almost became a study in linguistics when you went into the first 4 countries to start having these conversations, and the kinds of words that they used about to describe their access were different. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what kinds of words they were using and how this plays out in the data. How do you kind of take those words and find the similar meanings between them?
Do you want to tackle this, Laura? Go for it. My colleague, Laura Silver.
I think it depends what you mean by the linguistics that we use. So one thing that we do with the survey is when we translate it, and we translated it into almost 40 languages, we actually send it through a firm who looks to make sure that the words we're using are comparable across languages. It's really important for things like social media that we're using a term that connotes the same thing in every country, for example. And none of us are actually experts in the languages that the focus groups were conducted in, with the exception of in Kenya, where most of them were in English. But we spent a lot of time trying to figure out whether the words that people used in the focus groups were the ones that we were using in translation. We relied more on the English, obviously, because of our own linguistic abilities, but we wanted to be sensitive to things like fake news. That was a term that people used and actually used in English sometimes in the groups. So we did want to be sensitive to how people spoke about their own terms, but mostly we rely on an expert linguistics firm to help make sure we're asking the right things and consistently across all of our many, many, many languages.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, and I can't wait to hear what people make of all of this.